So last week we got some history. We found out about some agendas that were taking place behind the scenes. Eugenics, John Herschel, John Winslow, the people behind Darwin that were pulling strings. This week we're going to dive into some science. So this is, and you might have heard these before, but there's three main things we're going to do here. So make sure I know what I'm doing here, and let's just jump right in here. So we're trying to prove that evolution's impossible here. And, excuse me, we're going to focus on three main reasons why the theory of evolution was proven to be impossible many years ago, decades actually. So there's three things. The first thing is called irreducible complexity, and we'll talk about exactly what that is. The second thing is intelligent source requirement for information, so where information comes from. And the third thing is no intermediary fossil record exists. So we'll explain what each of these are, and we'll get into some specifics. So the first thing, irreducible complexity. The fact that certain biological systems are too complex to have evolved from simpler or less complete predecessors. In other words, certain biological systems will cease to function if any part is removed. And this proves that certain things, like a living cell, had to be created all at once as a whole thing, and it could not have evolved in steps. And the typical example that's used is a mousetrap. A very basic thing. Any one piece you take off the mousetrap, it will not work. So a mousetrap is irreducibly complex. It's a complex little mechanism, and you can't take anything away from it and still have it work properly. And there's a lot of things that fall into that category. So this again, and this is back to last week, that Darwin had about a half a dozen really important statements in his book that was like saying a red flag. Look, if you can prove this, then you can burn this book. The whole thing goes away. And it's really neat that he was wise enough and cared enough to make these statements. It's too bad most people don't listen to him. But if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, so a part of your body, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And Nancy, I think this is the one that you had mentioned you had heard before last week. So he's basically saying that if there's something that's irreducibly complex, the theory of evolution is no good. So during Darwin's time, they could see cells, but they didn't have powerful enough microscopes to see the inner workings of the cell. They believed cells were composed of a jelly-like substance that they actually called protoplasm. So it was just, they'd look and it would just be goo that they would see, and they'd see a little movement, and that was about it. There was no appreciation for the incredibly complex micro-machines that all work together within each cell. So this is the typical cutout of the cell that you have in your biology books at school. There are 17 main pieces that are identifiable by a typical microscope. We can actually buy on eBay or Amazon now and see this at home. So it's pretty incredible. The 17 parts, I don't need to tell what they all do, but they each have their own very specific function, very complex each piece. So the cell structure, each of these 17 cell structures is actually its own incredibly complex machine filled with dozens of smaller and more complex parts. So it's not just those 17, but all of those 17 break up into smaller, much more complex pieces. These parts create, store, and regulate things that require chemicals and molecular structures for use within the cell and to export to other cells to support the processes of life. So it's not only to support itself, but it also sending things out to other cells to help them. If any one of these cellular pieces was taken away, not only would that cell cease to function, but also any other external cells that required support from that cell type would also cease to function. Therefore, the entire cell structure had to be created at the same moment, and it could never have evolved in successive steps. And where is this coming up? All right. There are more than 17 unique types of cells. So there's nerve cells, muscle cells, bone cells, gland cells, blood cells, reproductive cells. More than 17 specific types of cells. So you got a whole nother layer of incredible complexity going on here. And there's an estimated 75 trillion cells in the average adult human body. So numbers that we can't deal with or even begin to comprehend. We're going to see a video now, and it's basically it's going to show us how a DNA strand is broken up within the cell and copied. It's actually, the first part of it is the copying of a DNA strand, and then the second part is going to have to do with a motorized flagellum, but we'll let him explain what we're about to see.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell. Here, the staggering complexity of its molecular machinery is clearly seen.
It's like going into an automobile factory. The factory has a large number of machines. The parts have to fit together in very specific ways to do their jobs, and if things go wrong, the cell is in big trouble. And just one cell is enormously complex, but humans, you and I, are made from trillions of cells, and those trillions of cells have to fit together in the right way and do their own job. Darwinism was a lot more plausible when we were thinking about globs of protoplasm than it is when we're thinking about molecular machines.
Each of these biochemical machines is a masterpiece of engineering and nanotechnology. They are essential to functions as vital and diverse as vision, photosynthesis, and the production of energy in the cell. Michael Behe has studied several of these machines, including the flagellum, a remarkable rotary motor.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It's had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor. And I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed, you know, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Behe's reaction was not surprising, especially when the bacterial flagellar motor is animated and magnified more than 50,000 times to display the details of its construction and operation.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
It's got some tail proteins which act as the propeller. When the flagellum rotates, these push against the water and therefore push the bacterium forward. And the motor uses a flow of acid from outside of the cell to the inside of the cell to power the turning.
The bacterial flagellum has 2 gears, forward and reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force. It has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
In all, about 40 different protein parts are required to build a flagellar motor. Half of them are constructor proteins, specialized mechanisms that assemble the flagellum's individual components. Since its discovery, biologists have tried to understand how a machine of such superb design could have arisen gradually, without foresight or plan, through the biological pathway Darwin envisioned.
I think what Darwin was trying to show was that things that look designed aren't really designed, but that we can find naturalistic processes to account for the complexity of life.
So it's unbelievable. It's just mind-boggling what's going on inside our bodies at levels that, and the thing is too, how do they know to do this? How do those little tiny parts know what they're supposed to do? So there's a whole nother level here of where they get their instincts from and how this whole thing works. It's just mind-boggling what's taking place in our bodies. So let's move on, and this is the second part, intelligent source requirement for information. So basically, this is a theory, I agree with it, that all information must come from an intelligent source, and this was first proposed by, or at least, I don't know if he was the first to propose it, but he was the first one to get credit for it. Dr. Werner Gitt, in his book, In the Beginning Was Information. And these are quotes from his book. There is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events that can cause information to originate by itself in matter. When information is traced backwards, it always originates at a mental source or a person as its creator. So what we're going to focus on is DNA, specifically the human genome, and the fact that it's comprised of huge amounts of complex information, and it had to come from a creator. So at the time when Darwin was alive, the existence of DNA was unknown. Since DNA was discovered, it has been amazing scientists and others as to the incredible amount of complex information that is contained within a single strand of DNA. It's located in the nucleus of every living organism cell, and it was part of the list of the 17 things. And just the beginning of the video showed those pieces of DNA coming in and being attached in an assembly line. It was actually copying a strand of DNA. So there are micro machines within the cell and the bodies of living organisms that are capable of breaking apart, copying, transporting, and then reassembling pieces of information that's contained within a strand of DNA. It's just beyond, if they gave us all the pieces on a plate in front of us, we couldn't do that. And this is taking place at a microscopic level. So these are things that are just beyond our comprehension. Amen. Amen. So I like these statistics. There are approximately 750 million bytes of information in a single set of human DNA. There's about 2,000 bytes of information on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So it would take 375,000 pages of extremely complex information to write out the information contained in the human genome. So number 3. And this is one of the most painful ones there is, and this gets close to the agenda. I would call this an agenda. This is very similar to the John Herschel that we learned about last week, with things taking place behind the scenes, the great moon hoax, and getting things published so that it manipulates the masses, because as soon as you get something published, it takes decades to get it unpublished. So this falls right into that bucket of goo. So basically what this is saying is if the theory of evolution was correct, a huge fossil record should exist between a less evolved species like the monkey and the more evolved species like the human that shows all of the middle steps that took place. So there are fossils for monkeys and there are fossils for humans, but there are no fossils for the hundreds or possibly even thousands of intermediate stages that would be required for a monkey to evolve to a man. This is true for every species. There are no intermediates for any species. And this is because God created monkeys and God created man as two separate and distinct species. So again, Charles Darwin, this statement's a little weaker, but it was supposed to open up people's eyes. And he's talking about the intermediary fossil record. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. And then he tries to explain why there aren't these intermediates. And the explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. So that's meaning that he's just saying that we haven't found them yet, we haven't dug in the right places yet. They're out there, give it time. It's just the geological record is a mess, so that it's out there somewhere. So he tried to cover it, but he didn't. So what about cavemen? And here comes the agenda. Aren't cavemen the intermediary link between monkeys and man? And when I say caveman here, and I think I put something in here about it, people lived in caves for thousands of years and made cave drawings. They were normal humans created by God. So there are cavemen that are humans, but when we say cavemen for the rest of the slideshow, I'm talking about the intermediary stages here. So I'm not going to be talking about humans when I say cavemen. So fraud and deception. Every intermediary fossil of man that has ever been found, in other words, caveman fossils, have been proven to be incompetent mistakes or purposeful frauds. And we'll get into this. This is some serious stuff that took place here, and it's still taking place. Typically, a single bone or very few bone fragments are found, and then an artist is hired to draw a rendition of what the caveman might have looked like. Every picture ever drawn and every life-size model ever sculpted depicts a caveman or a monkey man have been artwork based on nothing. It's incredible what has taken place here over the last 100+ years. Ernst Haeckel, this guy, I wouldn't doubt that he somehow was friends with John Herschel, the guy that we learned about last week. Really bad guy. He was a zoologist and an artist and an illustrator, lived 1834-1919, same group of guys here. He was one of the most obscene con artists of all times. He purposely used his artistic skills to create fraudulent illustrations in an attempt to become famous and to support an agenda of evolution. It was totally agenda-driven what he did. This is from one of his books. He had many books that he put out. So this is from the book called Evolution of Man, written in 1920. He presents a skull labeled Australian Negro as an intermediate evolutionary stage between the human skull, which is that one, and then the lower, these are orangutans and apes and monkeys, and it actually gets down to fish and reptiles at the bottom. So that skull is an imaginary skull that he purposely drew to fit in between. You can kind of see it shortens and starts to stretch out a little bit. And this was published and went out for many decades, being read and believed. In the same book, he had fraudulent embryos. So this drawing is from Haeckel's book, and it presents a comparison of embryos from different species: fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, calf, rabbit, and a human at the far right. The point of this diagram was to show that the early stages of development all look the same, and then they drastically change as the development proceeds, to show almost a micro-evolution taking place within the birth process. These were later proven to be fraudulent. And this has been used in textbooks for nearly 100 years. You will still find this in textbooks today. It's unbelievable. And it'll tell you how difficult it is to remove stuff once it gets put in. So the ones with the red X's, those are just outright fake drawings. They have nothing to do with the fish, the salamander, tortoise, and the chick reproductive. The pig, the calf, and the rabbit, the blue ones, those are valid stages of development, but they're not the first stage. They're not even close. So someone was good enough, a real scientist, to put together what that same thing should really look like. And you can see the top row, they're drastically different. They're very different on how they start, and they proceed differently. So they're very different from the beginning in most cases. So that entire diagram is extremely deceptive and just not valid for anything. Okay, so paleoanthropology. Some of the most damaging frauds have occurred in the field of paleoanthropology. So a paleontologist is a scientific study of prehistoric life like dinosaurs and plant life from fossils, old things. Anthropology is the study of humans. Paleoanthropology is the study of cavemen, and it's baseless and an imaginary field of study. It did not exist over 100 years ago. It's a brand new thing that was invented when these agendas were created. So this field of study didn't even exist 100 years ago. So let's get into the different cavemen that we've probably heard of. We've probably heard of most of these, but I think I got 6 or 7 of the big well-known ones and what the true story behind them is. So first one is Heidelberg Man. A partial skull was discovered near Heidelberg, Germany in 1970, and it was named the Heidelberg Man by Ido Schoensack, the man that found it. It was later to be proven to be the skull of a normal human being. Fraudulent models, scenes, and artworks were costing tens of thousands of dollars were created, and it took, for the Heidelberg Man, I believe about 30 years before they were able to get a hold of the skull and have other people look at it and find out that it was a human skull. Meanwhile, museums are being filled with these models and these scenes and these depictions, and people are just eating this stuff up. The Nebraska Man. An entire body was built up from a single tooth. The tooth was later proven to be from an extinct form of boar. That doesn't get much worse than this. This is just a disgrace. So that's the boar, and it's actually number 1 tooth. It's this tooth right here in the second row, actually, that was found. Piltdown Man. This was a strange one. Fragments of a skull were found in 1908 by estate workers digging in the grounds of Barkham Manor at Piltdown. But right off the bat, Barkham Manor, these are rich people. This is a huge manor, a huge estate. The skull fragments were given to Charles Dawson, who was an estate representative. He searched the site and he gathered up more pieces of the skull. Dawson contracted a guy, Arthur Woodward, and he was a paleontologist from the British Museum in London. And soon, an ape-like jawbone was conveniently discovered in the area and pieced together with the skull fragments. So, and then this just became crazy here, apparently. It's maybe tough to see the picture on the upper right, but hundreds of people would swarm there on weekends. So the Piltdown location was overrun with reporters and geologists, making both Dawson and Woodward rich and famous. So there's just a painting of the people that were involved at the time looking at the skull. And later it was determined that it was a human skull and the jawbone of an ape that were put together to form a purposeful fraud. The jawbone was filed down in spots to make it fit the human skull. And they actually there's better pictures than what I have here that show microscopic the file marks where they filed the skull down, because you can see it now. So they pieced the two together. And it took 40 years for this to be properly reviewed and proven to be a hoax. So meanwhile, this is being put into textbooks. People are being taught this in school. And that's a generation. People were taught their kids, and then they became old and didn't care anymore by this time. So pretty bad. Peking Man. Supposedly a 300,000 to 500,000 year old skull. This guy was really pushing the envelope on how old it was. He was going to do it. He's going to go for broke. So, but a lot of skull fragments found in a cave near Peking, China, between 1923 and 27. So there's some pictures of what they were and pieced together. 29 to 37 more bone fragments were found in the cave. Most of the study on these was conducted secretly by the man that found most of them, Davidson Black, until he died in 1934. Again, all kinds of artwork and museum-related things being done behind the scenes. The original fossils disappeared in 1941 during World War II, leaving only casts and written descriptions. There's no proof of anything that any of this was anything other than human skull fragments. So the whole thing is just fluff. Neanderthal man, we've all heard of this one. Partial skulls and bone fragments found in a cave in Belgium in 1829 by Philippe Charles Schmerling. He estimated them to be between 30,000 and 45,000 years old. He must have had a dartboard. You know, I mean, give me a break. So all of the bones have been proven to be human bones. It's just simple, and it's easy for them to prove these things now. It's not a big deal at all. So if valid scientists that care about the truth have access to this stuff, it's very easy to prove what's going on. And again, uncountable thousands of dollars and hours have been spent creating these fantasy scenes and artificial models to promote these mistaken cavemen and women. And you know, it gets sicker and sicker. They try to make the scenes so that people associate with them, that they get the people thinking, oh, these cavemen, you know, they were just like us, you know. They really are perverse. When they get going, they really start to twist stuff around. Cro-Magnon man, and we've probably all heard of this one too. Louis Lartet, French geologist, discovered the first of 5 skeletons of this type in a rock shelter named Abri de Cro-Magnon in 1868. 5 skeletons, just about the size of a family. Interesting that that's how many skeletons there were in this cave. All of the skulls have been proven to be human and not of any special type. Lucy, and this is the latest one. And this is just ridiculous. Now they got to pull you. We don't have a caveman. We got to get a cave woman in here now. We've manipulated everybody's brains enough, so we can do this now. So this is one of the greatest frauds ever committed. It was and still is the Lucy cave woman. The bone fragments shown on the right there were found in 1974 by Donald Johansson. He was the team leader in Ethiopia. Excuse me. And again, scenes all over the world. There's probably hundreds of different Lucy displays. These bone fragments were found over a huge geographic area. It's like a square mile. So in no way, shape, or form did these fragments come from one thing. Most of them proven to be non-human bones. And again, it's simple to do that now. In 1974, they weren't able to do that. They've also been shown to come from more than 30 individual skeletons because it was such a huge area. This is funny, and somebody actually took the time to put this together, that he would go around getting paid thousands of dollars to give talks about Lucy. And there were pictures taken, and somebody noticed that every single time he presented it, he set the bones up differently. He doesn't even know what bones are supposed to be what part. So it's just not good stuff. It's unfortunate. So that's the fraud and deception and that's being taught to our kids in school. And you'll notice that since Lucy, there have not been any more found, because they can be tested now, and people don't allow this foolishness anymore. They're good, godly scientists, Christian scientists, and I don't mean Christian Science, scientists who are Christians who jump on this stuff when, if it were to come out, they would be all over it like mold on bread. So I don't think we're going to be seeing any more cavemen stuff because they just can't get away with it anymore. So some final thoughts here. This is some other stuff beyond those 3 major things. So we had irreducible complexity, that you can't take away any parts from a living cell or it wouldn't exist, so it had to be created. We have The creation of data or information has to come from a creator. It can't just originate out of nowhere. And DNA is the most complex. I mean, we're handed DNA, you know, here's a plate of DNA, tell me what it means. We're not even close to being intelligent enough to break it down. We know a tiny little bit about a tiny little bit of it. And then the whole fraudulent caveman thing. So those are the three biggies that I usually focus on. But there's some other ones, and these are kind of neat. Male and female needed for reproduction. If something evolved, it would never evolve in two separate parts that are required to come together to reproduce. It would never happen. So just the fact that there's male and female, that alone by itself should be a huge red flag to say, well, you know, give me a break. Why would something evolve in two separate pieces like that? So that's a biggie. Pollination among plants required to reproduce, so it actually requires wind to be involved, and you need to have other plants nearby. So pollination is an incredible process. And not only is there the wind, but of course we all know about the bees. So certain types of plants actually require a living creature to become involved with their reproductive process. Evolution could never happen with that type of requirement for reproduction. Different types of seeds and how they can survive diverse environmental factors for such long periods of time and spread and propagate their species. Coconuts that are the protect. Has anybody ever tried to open up a coconut in the whole the whole thing? It's mind-boggling that seed and what's going on there. It has its own food inside of it. It's got an armor-coated shell. It floats. It can be bashed against rocks. It can last for years floating in the salt water. And then with just the right time and place, it can break itself open and it can grow a palm tree. It's just mind-boggling. There are certain types, and I want to say, and Clive, maybe you know this, certain types of pine trees, I believe, and it may be cedar, that the seeds fall on the floor of the forest, and until there's a forest fire that breaks the outer shell, it burns the outer shell away, those seeds will not germinate. So it actually requires a forest fire to allow the seeds to germinate. It's the strangest phenomenon. Do you know what? They absolutely, and you know the way you say everything works together, there's another part that I had on a slide that I've yanked because it was really physics-based. But there are like 40 different physical constants like gravity, electromagnetic force, the weak force, the strong force, these 40 universal constants that have to be very specific values. And if any one of those 40 things changed just a little bit, the whole entire universe would cease to function. It would not work properly. So there's so many other things involved with this. And that's it. So anybody got anything you want to hit me with?
Yeah, which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
The chicken came first. It was the chicken. Yep. Our junior high youth group, we used to teach that, and yeah, we actually hit them with that to see if they were paying attention. It better be the chicken. Yep. That's good.